opening statements. Members will be recognized in order of seniority. We'll also have members that are cycling in and out. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. And I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Dr. Gartenstein-Ross, I mean, the big question here is basically the First Amendment and how we prevent attacks, how we prevent, these terrorist attacks from happening, as I've heard your testimonies and read your written statements. So how do we differentiate between the constitutionally protected speech and then also the speech that may advocate for violence and terrorism? How do we protect the First Amendment and thwart that violence?
Thank you, Chairman Pfluger. That's a great question. One case that I recommend people to be familiar with is the Sami al-Hussein case. It occurred in Idaho shortly after the 9/11 attacks. He was prosecuted for terrorist propaganda. Ultimately, the jury found him not guilty based on First Amendment grounds, and after that case, there have been very few just propaganda prosecutions. I think Ranking Member Magaziner put it right when he talked about how there's no right to incite people to attack. There's no right to recruit people to terrorist groups. Foreign terrorists don't have a right. But I think when you get into that kind of gray area, I expect to see very few prosecutions. Instead, it's when there's incitement to imminent lawlessness, which is the First Amendment standard.
Thank you. Dr. Zellin, you mentioned something in your spoken testimony about Jabbar and his posting. And so I want to follow up on this question. Should we have known? Could we have known? What could have been done? And did his speech actually violate the protected speech, or was he still in that protected speech place?
Thank you, Chairman. It's definitely a complicated issue, but based off of Facebook's own policies through their dangerous organizations unit within the Facebook, they have their own sort of FTO list. And if you provide support to that group, which this individual did by pledging allegiance to the caliph, that would be considered contravening, their own policies. And again, these are private companies. This isn't related to speech about politics per se, but within the context of a private company that sets its own policies. Of course, there isn't such a thing as necessarily 100% security or successes in these issues. But if there were more proactive measures with more people involved in trying to follow these issues, I think it's definitely a possibility that something could be stopped for sure.
You talked about content moderation, and is it your belief that's done at the platform level?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Congress could potentially regulate to make sure that they actually follow a certain way of doing it, but there have been methodologies that have been laid out by the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, which is essentially a consortium of key American tech companies such as Google, X, Facebook, Microsoft, et cetera, in terms of how they find the digital footprint or fingerprint of these issues to take this content down. But the terrorists, of course, are evolving themselves as well. So it's key to try and stay on top of it, because as we take content down or ways of taking content, they try and then go around it. For example, instead of saying like the Islamic State or whatever, they'll put like dots in between each letter or an underscore so that it trips up the content moderation, at least in terms of, written types of stuff.
Thank you. Mr. Flesch, you talked about George Mason University. I was made aware that there was an incident on Georgetown's campus where a convicted terrorist named Ribi Karaja, who was found to be a member of the PFLP, was invited to speak and allowed to speak at a student-led organization or on campus there. So you've got somebody that was involved in a bombing in Israel that was part of the PLO and comes onto one of the campuses. Just what needs to happen here? What's the university's responsibility? And then conversely, what's the responsibility of either federal or state and local law enforcement?
Certainly, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd say the first thing is to recognize that while we all talk a lot about Hamas, and I focus on them in my testimony, the fact is there are a number of terrorist organizations related with the Palestinian population that has presence here. PFLP, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, goes back 50 plus years, involved in a U.S. designated terrorist organization. So recognizing that the threat is not just from Hamas, or Hezbollah, these other big names we hear about, there's a number of other organizations that also are designated U.S. terrorist organizations. So that's number one. Number two is reaching out to and ensuring that student groups on campus are aware of this, and those that do invite members of these organizations, those have been convicted for terrorism, and this individual was involved in the killing of a 19-year-old Israeli a few years ago, that they should not be involved, invited to campus and whatsoever. And I think from a federal perspective, you need to start looking into the universities that provide for these student groups, provide for these organizations, and if they give platforms to terrorists supporting individuals or terrorists themselves, they should withdraw federal funding from them.
I think it was shameful that the university allowed this individual to even announce such of a meeting. So my time has expired. I now recognize the ranking member.